Hello, sweet friends, and welcome back to the Quilter's Candy Shop, where you will find sweet treats for the discerning quilter. And welcome back to our Winter's Garden Block of the Month. This is episode number 11 and block number 9, which is technically the last step in this Block of the Month series, which means by the end of this episode, we will have a completed quilt top. So let's not delay, let's get started. Over the last year, we have learned a lot of fun piecing techniques, and I hope you found this series helpful and entertaining. If you did, I would kindly ask you to leave a comment, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. It's the best way you can help support and grow our channel, so more people can join in the fun. If you've been keeping up with the homework each month, you should have 9 large blocks. Whether they're pieced or appliqued or a mix, the 9 blocks are the focus and the center of this large bed quilt. After that, we added the sashing to highlight these large double star blocks. Then we added the split rectangle border for some color and dimension. And that brings us to our dramatic diamond borders, which we assembled last month. I absolutely love how these turned out, and I plan to use them again the next time I need to make one of my fast and easy quilts a little bit bigger. So here we are. You may recall that we made these borders a little oversized, so now we have to trim them down to fit. To complete the diamond borders and add them to our quilt center, we're going to measure all 4 sides of your quilt top. Normally, we would just measure through the center, top to bottom, or side to side, but in this case, we want our edges to be exactly the same size. Now, in a perfect world, all 4 of these measurements should be the same number, but I'm not perfect. So I added my 4 numbers together, then divided by 4, and that gave me the exact size I needed to make all 4 of my diamond borders. Now, take the number that you just calculated and divide it in half. That's the measurement we are going to use to make sure our diamond borders are the same size and that our diamonds are perfectly centered as we sew them onto the quilt top. So to do that, we're going to fold our diamond border in half, right through the center of this big center diamond. And then line everything up nice and taut. And then you're going to take that new calculated number, the one we just cut in half, and we're going to measure from the fold to the end and trim to fit the measurement. My measurement was 69 plus 68 3/4 plus 68 1/2 plus 68 3/4 divided by 4. That number is 68 3/4. Now I divide that in half by dividing by 2, which means I need to make my cut at 34 3/8. So I'm going to line this up at 34 3/8. This is not the 100% most accurate, but it is pretty close and it's going to work great. So there's 34 1/2. I got to come back 1/8 right there. And I'm going to make sure this is lined up along the bottom so I'm perfectly straight and perpendicular. And now I can trim. So now I'm going to do all 4 of my diamond borders exactly the same way to exactly the same measurement. While you have your diamond border folded in half right through the center diamond, you're going to mark one edge for the center. That's how we're going to know that that's the center and how to line it up on the side of the quilt top. You will also need to measure the side of the quilt top that you're going to apply this to and mark that center as well. That's how we're going to get all of our diamonds perfectly lined up with the center of the side of the quilt. Start by pinning the center diamond to the center of one of the sides of the quilt top. Then pin the ends so they line up nice and square. Also add a pin at the seam of the diamonds. That seam should line up with one of the seams from the brick border. Nest the seams and pin. You may want to add a few additional pins to secure everything in place so it doesn't shift on you while sewing. You may need to ease in either the border or the quilt top to get everything to line up. Sew the border to the top, right sides together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press the seams towards the border. Okay, I've got the diamond borders on the sides of the quilt center, but as you can see, this is a very big quilt. I actually have a king-size bed and it hangs down over the side. So I can only show you one corner of the quilt so you can see how it comes out, but look how great that diamond border looks. For the top and bottom border, we have to add the 16 patch scrap block to the end of the 2 remaining diamond borders. Okay, here are the last 2 diamond borders. I already have them trimmed to size and I have the centers marked, the same as the first 2. But now we have to add the 16 patch scrap blocks to the ends of these. That's going to make our top and bottom borders fit perfectly. One thing to consider is the registration of your scrap blocks. If you made them all scrappy, you probably don't have to worry about it. But if you made the blocks all the same, you may want to turn them so they rotate around in the corners. Or you can have the registrations all the same. That's going to be completely up to you. Once you have made that determination, you're going to add a block to each end of the border strips, right sides together, sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press towards the border. 1 16 patch on each end of the border strips, and then they will be ready to apply to the quilt top. Once you have your 16 patch scrap blocks sewn to the end of your border strips, you're going to add them to the top and bottom of your quilt center in the same way as you did the sides. Start by pinning the center diamond to the center of the bottom edge, then pin the intersection of the 16 patch to the seam of the side border, making sure the seams nest nicely. Secure the end of the row with a pin, and pin again halfway between the pins at the end of the diamond row. It should line up and nest with one of the split brick border pieces. Add extra pins to make sure it doesn't shift during sewing. You may need to ease in either some of the quilt top or the border piece to get everything to line up. Sew the border on, right sides together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press towards the border. Repeat the process again with the top border. Look at that! The diamond borders are on and they look fantastic. All that's left is to frame this up with a small inner border and then the beautiful directional outer border. I just love the way this is turning out and I can't wait to see the finished quilt top. So let's go! The next step for our block of the month quilt is to put the inner border in around the quilt top. This is the small blue border that goes around the diamonds. The explanation is on page 29 for block number 9. We're going to do 2 things at once. We're going to cut the teal plaid for the inner border, and we're going to go ahead and cut and prepare our binding strips out of the red plaid. The pattern recommends that you run your inner border length of grain. I'm not really a fan of that. I think it's much easier to cut cross grain, and I like the way it looks. So if you want to follow the pattern, you would cut length of grain 12 2.5 inch strips from your blue plaid. It also says that if you don't have directional fabric, then you can just cut 10 2.5 inch strips with the fabric. And that's what I'm going to choose to do. So as usual, we're going to start by straightening up the fabric with the 2-ruler method. And then I am going to cut 10 2.5-inch strips. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to straighten this up to 2.5 inches, and it will go in my scrap pile. Now, these get sewn end to end and then cut for the appropriate size for the sides of your quilt first, and then the top and bottom. But while we've got everything at the cutting board, we're going to grab the red plaid that is set aside for our binding. The pattern calls for 11 2.25-inch width of fabric strips for binding. I want to point this out because most people make 2.5-inch strips for binding, and I believe that if you try to cut 2.5-inch strips out of this piece, you won't have enough. So go ahead and cut your binding strips at 2.25 as the directions say. I don't think you'll see that much difference in your binding, and it's going to save you a little bit of fabric. Again, we're going to straighten the edge and have a good starting cut. And then we need 11 2.25-inch cuts width of fabric. And there you go. Now you have your binding pieces cut, and you can go ahead and sew these end to end and press your seams open. For both of these strips in the directions, it says do not use a 45-degree angle seam or you won't have enough fabric. So make sure you use a nice straight seam to sew these all together end to end. I'm going to go ahead and get these sewn onto my quilt top, and then we'll go on to the final border. All right, look at this. I love the addition of this inner border, and it's a perfect example of what an inner border can do. It just pulls everything together and gives a nice little frame before we add the beautiful directional border that's coming next. So let's talk about that. Now for the final border. There are 3 ways to put this border together. The first way is to follow the pattern and cut your border strips length of grain. There are some benefits to this. The length of grain is more stable, it doesn't stretch out of shape easily, and makes seamless borders. This works great if you're working with non-directional fabric. However, our main print for our outer border has these cute little birds, and as such, it will look better if the birds are facing the proper direction. The second way to cut your border strips is to cut enough width of fabric strips to make your top and bottom borders, and then cut the remaining fabric with the length of grain to complete the side borders. This takes a little bit more math to make sure you have enough fabric, and there will be a few more seams in your borders, but your side borders will benefit from being on length of grain, and your top and bottom borders will be facing the proper direction. This is the ideal way to have your borders set, but not everyone wants to do the extra work to accomplish this little bit of perfection. The third way is the most common way to cut borders, and that is to cut all of your borders width of fabric and sew them together end to end with all the motifs facing the same direction. Even with directional fabric, this works because you'll be able to apply your borders so that all the motifs face toward the quilt or face out away from the quilt. This has by far the most seams, but is the fastest and easiest way to make borders. Whichever way you choose to make your borders, make sure you are using straight seams. There is definitely not enough fabric provided to use 45-degree diagonal seams. If you want to use diagonal seams, you will need to add at least 1 yard to 1.5 yards extra to your border fabric in your purchase. That way you will accommodate the extra 16 inches needed at every seam allowance. After much contemplation, I have decided I am going to cut mine with the fabric all the way, and I'm going to make my birds face in on all 4 sides of my quilt. But you do yours the way you would like. Okay, and here it is. It's all done. And again, I have to just show you the one corner because it's so big that it goes over the sides of the bed. But I'm going to pull back and do a large view with it set up like a regular quilt. But before we get to that, I do want to point out, make sure that you do your stay stitching along this edge to hold everything in place, keep seams secure, and to keep the edges from fraying. This is such a big quilt that it will stretch, so you want to make that nice and tidy. And there is a lot to prepare on a quilt like this for your long armor. So I'm going to link above, up here, a video that tells you how to get your quilts ready for the long armor. It will really help for this quilt. Okay, sweet friends, here's about the best shot I can get for this quilt that's so huge on my king-size bed, believe it or not. And I'm going to try and angle this down so you can see the bottom, how it hangs all the way off the end. I hope you enjoyed this Block of the Month series and that you learned some helpful tips, tricks, and new techniques along the way. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and leave us a little snowflake emoji in the comments. We would really appreciate it. If you'd like to know the next time we do a fun project like this, give that subscribe button a little tap and turn on the bell for notifications. And don't forget to stop by the shop at www.thequilterscandyshop.com. That's SHOPPE shop.com, and find more exciting sew-along projects. Thanks for watching. Now, go sew something sweet. Bye!